All right, welcome everyone to our event talking about climate change and the language we use to talk about it. Thanks everyone so much for being here this evening. This is such a rich and important topic right now, and I'm super excited to hear from our panelists, all of whom have written, tweeted on this topic at various points. I'll introduce them now. Mary Annaïse Heglar is a climate justice writer, and she's the co-founder and co-host of the Hot Take podcast and newsletter, which I can't stress enough. It's just fantastic. You should subscribe. I think we'll have the link in the chat shortly. Her essays have been published in Vox, the Boston Globe, Rolling Stone, other outlets, including TNR, and she is newly based in New Orleans, so she's had an interesting couple months, I suspect. Brian Kahn is an award-winning editor and writer. He currently runs Earther, whose climate coverage has been spectacular recently, and is a lecturer for Columbia's MA in Climate and Society. His work has also appeared in The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, and Grist. He's got some really interesting stories about elk on the event link that we have for this, so I encourage you to check those out. John Patrick Leary holds a PhD from NYU. He's the author of A Cultural History of Underdevelopment, Latin America and the US Imagination, also Keywords, the New Language of Capitalism, and the upcoming book, Keywords, the Language of Politics. He's a regular contributor to TNR, and he writes a column about language and politics and power. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here this evening. I think that this is something that we often talk about sort of as an aside, or, we have particular pet peeves. Often I think the most formal discourse about language and how we use it and how language can serve powerful interests comes more in the topic of like authoritarianism. Famously, George Orwell wrote about how jargon, unclear language can serve authoritarian regimes, but I think something that we're all increasingly aware of is the extent to which this can be an issue with climate change, unintentionally borrowing jargon from corporate greenwashing, or perhaps, using jargon that's specific to a particular movement that people outside the movement don't necessarily understand, or just in terms of the way we frame certain things. So I'd love to open this up by just asking each of our panelists, like, what's a pet peeve of yours in climate change and language? So I just, screw it. Let's start alphabetically. Mary, do you want to go?
How'd you know? I have many. There are many phrases and terms that get on my nerves, but the one that is driving me the most up the wall lately is human behavior. You hear it all the time, but especially in the wake of the latest IPCC report, it was like, scientists confirm human behavior is driving climate change. Like, which human behavior and which humans? Like, that's not specific enough. Like, that's like saying mammal behavior caused climate change, right? Like, human beings have been on this earth for a very long time. And if our behavior just innately caused climate change, I feel like we would have been wiped out a long time ago. So it's not human behavior, it's fossil fuels, it's extraction, it's capitalism. Like, and I don't know a lot of scientists, quite frankly, who don't see that. Like, I don't know a lot of scientists who would say like breathing air causes climate change, right? Like, because that's not true. So throw that sentence out. But it's like, they understand that the reason we're here is because of extractive practices like fossil fuels, like out of control animal agriculture. Like, those are not natural human behaviors. That is human behavior gone absolutely wild in a capitalist system.
So basically the use of the term human behavior winds up serving as a cover for fossil fuels or for other interests.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's a good one. Yeah, that report was a doozy for close readers. Brian, what's your pet peeve?
I think this is honestly a really unfair question to start with by just having like one.
You can go around multiple times.
Okay, we can just take this merry-go-round.
What's your top three? Top three.
Top three. That's true. We could do this 3 times. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll start with one. And like I actually really need to write about this because it's like it makes me so angry. Is I really, really hate the phrase stranded assets to describe oil and gas. Thought about this like a lot. I don't know why I haven't written this story, honestly, because it's really pissed me off for a long time. But this idea, I mean, that's a business jargon term. Stranded assets. this idea that oil and gas itself is a stranded asset is just like a joke to me. I mean, I've been trying to think of like a good analogy, and in my head I was like, well, I mean, it's kind of like saying like, like bullets in a gun are stranded assets or things like that. Like these are really dangerous things, and if we keep digging them up, like it will kill us. It will irrevocably alter the course of Earth in ways. I mean, we already have done that by digging up what's under there, but if we keep going and seek out all the reserves that we can, I mean, that is a recipe for absolute catastrophe. And so I think that when we talk about stranded assets, when we frame it in business terms instead of like the life and death situation that really is to keep, digging up oil or not, we're doing the industry's work with that front. So if I could, end one word, and if I could convince everyone on this call today to stop using one thing, that would be number one for sure. But I will happily come back and say many more words that I also wish would leave our discourse around climate.
I'll admit I share that pet peeve. Yeah. For those who do not know, like our viewers who don't necessarily know what stranded assets classically means, do you want to clue them in?
I mean, so in the context of oil and gas, like that's the easiest one to put it, I guess, in this discussion. But it's essentially things that like it becomes uneconomical to extract the oil and gas. So it just basically is they're on the balance sheets for these companies. They're assets until suddenly they aren't assets because it's either it becomes too expensive or gas prices drop too low, whatever it is, and it becomes basically economically unviable to dig up the oil, and thus becomes stranded assets. When the reality is they're not really assets to us at this point.
Yeah, and like it's also often used to talk about what if a country passes climate policy and therefore people have stranded assets, which makes it sound like a bad thing. I don't know. What I hate about that term, because we have talked on Twitter about our hatred of this term, but is that it's like jargon no one understands. But if they do understand it, it's uncritically accepting this weird sort of corporate ideology that says that climate policy is bad because it strands assets. It's like, no, it's a bad investment. Yeah.
It's strange too, if I can just jump in, it's strange how it sort of like frames oil and gas as if it's like a castaway on a desert island or something, it's like ironically kind of foreboding the future of like mass flooding after climate change. Just makes it especially perverse.
Absolutely, yeah. Man, we could talk about stranded assets all night, but John, do you want to go in with your pet peeve?
Yeah, I mean, it's like asking me to choose my favorite child or something. My least favorite, my worst pet peeve, because I have a lot of them. But I mean, stranded assets is a new one. I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's a new one for me. I guess the ones that I was thinking about most recently are the ones that kind of frame climate change or kind of political responses to climate change as kinds of individual choices, consumer choices, and political choices that take place like within the confines of the free market, or the so-called free market, and do so in a way that kind of promises, or at least holds out the promise of continuing to live more or less as we do, but with some changes. So like adaptation, climate adaptation would be one that kind of suggests that it's merely a matter of kind of rebooting or retooling our present day infrastructure and economic system and political kind of systems of governance. I mean, infrastructure is another one of those terms that kind of alludes to, but without often underlining what is at stake. And resilience, climate resilience would be another one for me that also kind of promises a kind of continuity without disruption or without kind of transformation. And then like the one that maybe more like peculiar one that I've been kind of fixated on recently, because I had this sort of day job recently where I was cataloging park trees for the Philadelphia park system. And my coworker and I, we started to get really annoyed about the use of the concept of trees as allies against climate change. It's like a kind of a headline you see a lot, and a sort of a phrase that I encountered a lot, which is a sort of, it's a way of both anthropomorphizing plants, which is annoying in its own right, but it's a way of kind of misidentifying trees as individual creatures rather than as like part of a forest ecology or something, which is sort of the relevant point, because it also misidentifies the problem of deforestation as a kind of lack of, as a problem of tree insufficiency. Like we don't have enough, we need to plant more trees, rather than as a problem of just like logging and the extraction of wood resources. So that's like it's a sort of peculiar pet peeve of mine, but it's one that kind of, I think, speaks to a problem that you see in like the other examples we've talked about, which is that basically there's this kind of persistent fantasy, I think, of a kind of growth solution to climate change, or a kind of answers to climate change that kind of will be consistent with economic growth. And that's, I think, the kind of pernicious sort of fantasy that a lot of our language sort of shields us from wrestling with.
So, okay, you started off with terms that were—
Sorry, yeah, I have a lot of—
Yeah, you weren't kidding. So you started off with terms that basically their problem was vagueness, like lack of specificity, and then moved to some that were basically implying a kind of causal relationship. Well, how would you characterize it?
Well, just that promise that the kind of the growth within like a market system is consistent with for lack of a better word, a solution to the crisis of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, I feel like we definitely have to go around and give everyone else a chance to add more terms now, because John threw out a bunch. Yeah, Mary, do you have someone you want to add?
Yeah, someone in the Q&A asked about carbon footprint. Hate that one too. I hate terms like net zero, not so much because I hate that term when the oil industry uses it, because I hate when they talk at all. But also like terms like net zero are very easily co-opted. So like we do need to get to net zero, but not as an end goal, as like a benchmark along the way. And however, it sounds like zero. And so that means that people like BP can use it to make it seem like they're greener than they are. And another term I hate is natural gas. That shit is methane, and we should just say that.
I was wondering how long it was going to take for someone to talk about natural gas and methane. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'll let Brian weigh in with a couple as well, but I feel like there's also more we could get to that jump off from carbon footprint, natural gas, methane are very much on that sort of theme.
Well, I'll actually add a new one to the mix, which I just saw today for the first time, and I already have like mixed feelings about it, but I sense we'll see more of it, which was, it was not bad by someone, the founder of Carbon 180, which is a nonprofit focused on carbon sequestration, so pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. I think their work is, I actually think it's really interesting how they think about this stuff, but the founder of it had a piece in Fortune, and the headline was like, net negative is the new net zero. And in my head, I was like, oh no, man, like you just like, that is going to be so true. And in like a few years, like we're going to see BP or, fill in the blank, Microsoft, basically committing to net negative. I mean, in some ways, actually tech companies already do this around water. I think Google and Microsoft both have like net negative water pledges so that they will replenish more water than they use, which is very nice. And I'm sure there is some interesting science behind it, but this idea of net negative emissions, I mean, we are so far from negative emissions at a scale that's needed. So the idea that this is going to become the new pledge that people push for, that companies push for, is very just like kind of terrifying and daunting to me, because it means that, it's a way to obfuscate and essentially let emissions rise from their activities and say, oh, we're sucking them down somewhere, or we will down the line when it's available. And it really is something that is just going to be, I think, we do need to talk about these technologies, but using them in the service of letting companies that pollute be propped up is a really dangerous thing to play. And I worry that, it's going to become like the term net negative is going to lose all meaning, just like net zero is already close to losing all meaning. And who knows what comes after that? I don't even want to think about it, but I'm already angry just thinking what's coming in 5 years.
I feel like we could probably drill down further on net zero, just because I think you basically gave a pretty good explanation for the problem with net zero, and sort of Mary talked about it as well. But for like attendees who aren't familiar with what's implied by that term, net zero is a real favorite term specifically for companies that are releasing their environmental plans. And so you'll frequently see fossil fuel companies that are projecting like, here's how we're going to get, well, that's a bad example because Exxon's nowhere near like projecting net zero, but a random company, and we won't name names here for any number of legal and other reasons, but let's say a random company announces a plan to reach net zero. Oftentimes that doesn't actually mean reaching a point where they don't emit anything because they're using all solar panels. It's oversimplified. That's not what it means. Instead, it means that they're actually going to use some kind of thing involving carbon capture, which means like capturing the carbon from their smokestacks, or it's going to mean like we're going to buy offsets, which involve carbon sequestration, or we're going to like plant trees or something, all of which as technologies are so much more complicated than just, adding and subtracting from balance sheet. So basically, feel free to jump in, everybody. But the problem with net zero is that it obscures the fact that they aren't necessarily reducing emissions.
Yeah, the problem with net zero is that it's not zero. And because it sounds like zero, it allows people to kind of like get this idea of their head. So like we need to get to a point where we are, and this is going to sound very like crude, but literally we need to be sucking carbon out of the air. And net zero for a fossil fuel company and net zero for the world are very different things. So a fossil fuel company using net zero means that they're going to keep their operations the way that they are, and they're going to use this carbon capture and storage technology, which is exactly what it sounds like. I don't know where the carbon goes. Like I still am not clear about this. Like, do they just like put it in a ball and bury it? Like reverse dinosaurification. I don't know. Somebody can correct me on that. But
interesting techniques. We can send some links later. Yeah, it's an interesting subject.
So this technology is nascent. It doesn't like super exist right now, but the little bit of it that we have, the little bit of development of it that we do have, we need to be using to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere that's there without their bullshit. Oh, can we curse?
I think the answer is yes. We just
okay, cool, because I just did. But yeah, so they can take these like vague corporate jargony sounding terms and twist them to their benefit. And if you don't know what they mean, you can really feel like oil companies are on the right side of history, right? Like I watched, MSNBC with my mom, and all you see are fossil fuel ads, and you think that they're going to save the world with algae if you don't know any better. And a lot of people don't know any better because a lot of people aren't climate scientists.
I mean, some of this too, like it's not, I think like it runs cover for oil companies, but it also runs cover for, major financial institutions. And one example that stood out to me, and one that I had to like look up the quote before coming on this, because I was like, I need to make sure I get this right, because I thought it was just one of the wildest things I read, was earlier this year, Mark Carney, who's a big guy at Brookfield, which is a huge private asset management company, like, I think trillions of dollars under control, said that their portfolio was net zero. And his reason, which I will read directly from, is the reason we're net zero is that we have this enormous renewables business, which is like not true at all. He basically said, we avoided so many emissions that the rest of our portfolio is cleaned up. And that's like, that is the classic, just like bait and switch approach to this. And the way these terms these companies are obliterating the meaning of these terms. Like they may have scientific meanings, but like, once they end up in the PR departments and work their way through these firms, they end up meaning something totally different to the point that they're essentially meaningless.
So I feel like, and that's an interesting, the different terms people have been naming have kind of like danced around this issue. But as you just put it, part of the issue is that we're actually letting PR departments define the terms of the conversation. It's a way of like corporate policing of the Overton window, so to speak, like the bounds of acceptable discourse. John, I feel like it's time to talk about climate risk, which you've written about for TNR, but just like the term climate risk as a way of financializing human devastation.
Yeah, I mean, it plays on a kind of ambiguity in the word risk, which is, the word that the way that a kind of, I think a normal person would understand risk is like a kind of danger, a risk is the danger that something will happen to you if you do something or if you don't do something. But risk in a financial sense is something that you manage in order to find a preferable return on your investment. So risk isn't necessarily something you want to avoid, but it is something you want to control and manage. And so when something like the investment firm BlackRock, which was the subject of that article, announces to great fanfare and with great pats on the back from themselves to themselves that they are devoting more of their portfolio to combating climate change. They say that they are doing both of these things, like mitigating the risk to investors and also addressing the risk to average citizens. But you can manage the risk that climate change will pose to your investments by, investing in real estate that's 100 miles inland. That's like a way of managing the real estate investment risk. And so, it's an example of the way in which climate change as something that is driven by the market, but also can be turned by the market to profit, like anything else. I mean, it can become a source of wealth if it's left to the auspices of a market which has its eye on short-term returns always.
I feel like I want to push us to a somewhat related question, which is whether there are any turns within climate activism right now that maybe aren't as helpful as climate activists think they are. Because I think we could, to be clear, these things are not equal. Like we could talk about corporate speak for the entire time, and that would be probably ethically entirely fair. But I'm just curious in terms of, are there ways in which the language that media people, also activists, use to talk about what they're doing might be either inaccurate or somehow unhelpful to the broader discourse?
Can I ask a question about that for the other people? It's something I'm curious about, which is the term climate justice as it gets used, because my suspicion about it, or anxiety about it, I guess, has to do with the way in which it can be, I guess, the way in which it can be appropriated, but in the way in which it can be kind of used to shield certain interests who use it and separate the problem of the climate from like the problem of the economy and of poverty and geographical distributions of injustice and so forth. So I'm just wondering what people think about climate justice in light of.
In turn, I have a question about your question. Do you think that economic justice and like solving poverty is not a question of ultimately justice? Or do you think it's a question of like purely economics?
No, I don't think it's a question of purely anything. But my concern is that that when you hear climate justice used, that it is framing problems of the effects of climate change as kind of problems just of infrastructure or of and not of kind of underlying systems of racial and economic inequality. That's what I mean.
Is your point, John, that it's not pointed enough, that it doesn't fully call out the inequality, or is it? Sorry, I'm trying to understand what you're.
Yeah, I guess that's part of it, and also just that there's the tendency to separate the question of like climate adaptation or climate change mitigation or whatever from systems of inequality and systems of poverty that seem to not have to do with the climate or the environment, like residential segregation or something.
I'll respond to Heather's question first and then come back to this. So Heather, your question about like terms that people think are more effective than they really are.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a time that I proposed that we call plant milks milk, like not milk. I was just playing around on Twitter and people were like, we should call it pilk because it's plant milk and pilk is name it for what it is and what it isn't. And I was like, pilk does not sound like anything anybody would ever drink. Like you overthought and just went right on to the other side of, like, pilk sounds disgusting. It's like pea milk. So yeah, that's kind of the first thing that came to mind. That didn't take off, thank God. But I think decarbonization is another word. It's just like my eyes glaze over by the time that word is over. Like I understand the concept, but it's not sexy, it's not accessible. And there are a lot of other jargony words that I know I'm going to think of as soon as I get off this call, but that's the first one that jumps out to me. And then the idea, I love the term climate justice because I think it does reframe climate as a problem of power, because I think justice is ultimately about power. It's about the power structure. And I think inequality is an injustice. Therefore, climate justice encapsulates all of that. And I also can't think of another term that would encompass that, because climate action damn sure doesn't, right? Like I love the distinction between climate action and climate justice, because all climate action is not aiming, like BP's little, net zero thing, that is a climate action, but it is a grave climate injustice. It's also ineffective and, inadequate. But yeah, I think climate justice is one of the better terms that we've come up with, because it reframes it with everything else that you care about. And for me, I had a very hard time involving myself in climate work until I saw how it connected to police violence and economic inequality and all of these other problems, because without that connection, it felt like here's yet another thing to worry about. And now that I see those interconnections, it's not another thing to worry about. It's just another dimension of everything I'm already worried about. So yeah, that's how I see it. Right.
I mean, I was just thinking, like, it's interesting you said that, Mary, like, because I mean, I came to climate from a very, like Heather mentioned, I hung out with elk for a living before getting into climate. So it was like kind of that more traditional enviro background. I see Mary, she's like, oh God, this embarrassing story. This guy's talking about the elk again. Sorry. But I do think, like, the justice thing for me, I mean, like, it's like, so everyone has their own into climate, right? And like, for me, it was, it was kind of the elk. It was also like redwood trees, it was skiing. Like, it was like pretty traditional enviro stuff. But I do think that, like, in seeing the focus on climate justice and justice as like an organizing principle for people has really changed the way we discuss climate, and has sort of shifted that conversation away from, like, I mean, I think that conversation shift maybe Ari was happy away from, like, save the trees or whatever, to like more like save the people. But I think that when we talk about climate justice, it has really brought in, like, people, it has opened the door for more people to latch onto this because they can see themselves as part of the story. So I think it's actually, I also agree. I think it's a pretty helpful term. And I think, I mean, personally, as a journalist, it's honestly really helped frame a lot of the ways that I think about climate as well. And so I think, I think it's a step in the right direction. That doesn't mean that there aren't parts of it that are maybe challenging, like, things like green jobs and things like that are one of those more like squishy terms where, like, I mean, being a nurse is a green job, just like wind turbine technician is a green job. And so I wonder if there are ways to discuss those kinds of things to get more people engaged, or to activate people, as opposed to these really broad terms that don't, that's certainly not in the level of net zero and BP making that announcement, but like, I think that that's areas where, like, you can get a lot more specific about what does climate justice look like to get people engaged.
Yeah, two things. First, I love that Mary brought up decarbonization, because I think that's such an incredibly rich topic as a word. Also because I feel like it frequently leads people to forget about methane and natural gas. And it's had, it just sort of people's minds work when they hear decarbonization, if they don't just fall asleep, which is also a very good point. But yeah, I mean, I think I kind of like the term climate justice. I was thinking about this as you guys were discussing. I think that it's a useful term for something that we didn't we didn't really have a good term for prior to that necessarily. I will say one term that, and I sent this to you guys ahead of time, one term that I have some fears about going forward is frontline communities. And that's solely because it's not very specific. And I worry that we're going to start to see like oceanfront mansions described as frontline communities, when that's not really what people mean with the term, like currently with the term frontline communities, in terms of communities that have been put on the front lines through deliberate inaction of governments and who have been put in the paths of like polluting coal plants. You know, those two things aren't equivalent at all. And I'm wondering whether and if not, it's fine. If any of you have thoughts on frontline communities or ways in which you're already seeing words that sort of started out okay being co-opted.
Part of the problem I would think about frontline communities is that when it's used, I would think that it's never used by people who think they live in one. It's used to refer to somebody else. Is it not?
No, people who live in frontline community, I think they coined the term.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the term started out, I think, extremely useful. This is more like my fear about where it's going, and maybe I'm totally off base here.
I think that it could get co-opted, but I think that that's the problem with describing a power structure, is that almost anything can get co-opted. I think that part of our problem in this space is that the environmental movement, climate movement, whatever we're calling it these days, has kind of operated under this idea of like, we just got to find the right words. Once we find the right word, that's going to be like the magic key. And then people will stop doing what they're doing. These companies will stop, the government will act, and like everything will fall into place. That's kind of why political will was kind of left as the last thing to do, to get to act on climate. And so while I do think it's important to interrogate and investigate the words that we're using, I want to just make the point that like there is no word that's going to unlock some magic door. What I would like to see us do is start creating more words and leaning on more vocabulary that talks about what we want to build and less about what we want to destroy. So the words that drive me the craziest are the ones that are framed about decarbonization, degrowth, divestment, because it's all about what we don't want to have. And like, we need to be building. We need to be building something. This is not all of, and it also feeds into that narrative that environmentalism is all about taking things away. And so we need to start, you know, having generative words and regenerative words.
I think that's a really great thing to say, Mary. I was thinking about that with decarbonization, and like, I mean, one, to Heather's point, that it like sidesteps like methane and other greenhouse gases, and two, that it is kind of wonky. And I say this as somebody that like uses it sometimes. I mean, probably more than sometimes, which is just like old, you know, it's hard to break those old habits, right? But so I've been trying to use more lately, and I'd actually be curious, maybe folks would think this is a terrible step and I'll stop doing it. But it's like this idea of like electrifying everything, because I think it goes back to the idea decarbonization is taking things away, right? Whereas electrifying everything like is giving something people new. And honestly, I mean, I don't know, like electricity is totally cool to me. I think it's like really exciting to think about, you know, electric cars on the roads, electric houses, things like that. Right. And so that to me is like, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think that those words like are reflective of the type of conversations we're having. It's less that we're not using the right word to describe the thing. We don't talk enough about what we want to build. We're always talking about what we want to destroy. And like, I get that, like I'm all about destroying some stuff, don't get me wrong. But we do need to have those conversations about what to build. And then maybe we would be using those terms. It's kind of like we use like stranded assets is not, it kind of falls into the same sort of category, you know, so. Sorry.
I mean, there's a book that came out a few years ago that I have on my shelf that I open up every now and then just to like get a little inspired. It's called An Ecotopian Lexicon. And I think it's a really interesting idea where it's borrowing words from other cultures or, you know, or words that don't even exist, things that we need to be talking about. Because I think some of this does go back, like it's not like there are, you know, there's a path where we just find the right words and everything gets fixed. But I do think it really, language does open certain doors, and in some cases for what we want to build, it might not exist yet. Like those words might not exist. And so I think that there's a really rich way to draw on not just like, you know, the conversation, the things, the structures we have now, but like the language that could exist to describe these things, which is really exciting.
It also strikes me that the problem of, political language and climate change is a problem of identifying the problem and identifying the people who are guilty, to put it sort of bluntly, and less about like marketing the new society to emerge from whatever process we hope takes place. So I mean, in defense of destruction, I guess, or in defense of retaining that sort of emphasis, I think the problem remains kind of ill-defined for a lot of people, and certainly like in the kind of media discussion, at least.
I think I think Mary's point is a really important one, though, because there is a political reality here, which is that unless you present people with some kind of vision of what a future without fossil fuels looks like, it's not going to happen, right? I mean, to a certain extent, we have to be able to talk about the positive sides as well as the tearing stuff down. And I think it's a problem. It's a problem just from a journalistic perspective too, because I think that sometimes we just don't have the right terms, in particular to headline a piece. It's hard to have shorthand that like talks about what you're trying to, like this is something I ran into pretty recently, talking about the Harvard divestment story, where it's like, we don't have a good term for what it means for a university to be fully free of fossil fuels right now. There were, for a while, like the call was divest. And, but that's not really talking about whether fossil fuel money goes into like funding a center for green technology, or whether, what's another good example? Whether there are partnerships, like there's all kinds of different ways in which a university or think tanks frequently, which have been in the news recently, can in fact be entangled with fossil fuels. We don't really have the language to talk about that. And I'm wondering whether any of you have thoughts of like topics or themes that we lack the right language to talk about yet, or that we don't have good shorthand, or we haven't figured out an accurate way of depicting it at this point.
I mean, I still don't think that we're all the way in knowing how to talk about collective and individual action. I think that like maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, we were so far on the other side of it, where it was like people thought that all they could do was buy, better straws and get some solar panels, and that was all climate action could ever be. And like feeling that the entire climate crisis was the fault of them not doing those things. And now I think we've swung over to the other side of the pendulum, where people are like, well, it's not my fault, it's BP, it's Shell, and like, therefore nothing I do matters. Which is like, it is their fault, but that doesn't mean that nothing you do matters. So like we've swung a little bit too far on that pendulum. And I feel like, it wouldn't be terribly hard to shift it back. But also like trying to get people to understand that collective action is important. People don't understand that collective action is made up of individual actions quite yet. And that while you can buy your solar panels and go vegan and get an electric car and all of those things, you can also show up to demonstrations. You can also run for office. You can also show up to a panel like this, that all of those things are individual actions, and that individual action is more than just your consumer activity. So I think that's one area where we're still struggling. I think we also, like, I know I just said this, but we're struggling to talk about what we want to build. And I think that's why the Green New Deal was so exciting and galvanizing, because for once we were talking about what world do we want to build? What do we want to see? Not just what do we see? And that's the conversation that I think is still in its infancy and needs to continue to grow.
And I think a big challenge of that, though, is also just the particular, the sort of particular nature that of climate change as a problem that, at least until recently, was always discussed as a sort of like endlessly deferred future. And I realize it's not talked about that by everybody all the time, or experienced that way by many people most of the time. But it doesn't lend itself as easily as other kinds of sort of temporally bounded events, like in a political vocabulary, like an election or a campaign or a revolution or a war or something. So it's part of the challenge of talking about it is also, I think, talking about it like in the present tense and talking about it as a kind of event rather than just as a thing that we are risking in the future,
Just a framing issue as well as a language one, I think, in individual pieces. Yeah.
I mean, also like one thing that really jumps out to me, and I mean, I personally struggle with, is like really how do we deal with the concepts around climate grief? I mean, this is like such a nascent thing that I think people are feeling. And, we've seen this in like, I mean, there's a study that came out, I think just last week or the week before, showing that, young adults are extremely anxious about climate change. They are dealing with like severe, in some cases, emotional trauma around it. And, this is a new thing. I mean, and it's sort of like the field of psychology itself is behind the curve. And I think that, personally, I mean, I know I personally am behind the curve in figuring out how I talk about this and how I process it. I mean, this has been the summer from hell to be a climate journalist, which feels like something I say every summer. But it really, this summer, like something just hit different. And it's been really hard to like figure out how to talk about the things that like I feel inside and separate out, the things that are tied to what's going on in the world writ large versus just at my job and like covering horrible things. And like, I think that, in general, like that is like the language of how we talk about being upset about the things we're losing, how we talk about, the personal impacts, but also the fact that this is a collective experience that we as, billions of humans are going through. That's just an area that, yeah, we're at step one of just kind of like acknowledging it exists. And I think that it's really incumbent on us to figure out how do we talk about this and, deal with all that it comes with it.
Yeah. And I'm not saying this to like, do a shameless plug, but I think it's why it's so important and why it's happening that we're having so many new podcasts pop up about climate change, because people don't know how to have these conversations. It's kind of like existed as this thing that like, hangs over people's heads, but no one wants to acknowledge the elephant in the room for so long. And so, I mean, I've been really excited to see so many different types of podcasts stepping on the scene. There's like narrative and news and free-form conversations where people kind of get to hear what a climate conversation sounds like, and it gets normalized. I know Earther just launched a new one with my work wife, Amy, and I'm still processing that. You'll never steal her from me.
I'm so sorry to steal it, but I will say it actually goes, shameless plug since we're doing them, like it goes back to Heather's discussions about divestment, her feelings on that. Like this podcast is on, it's in collaboration with Drilled and Amy Westervelt, who's an amazing journalist and Mary's work wife. And I promise you can have her back. But it's on the influence of big oil on education. And the last episode will be focused on higher education. And it's honestly incredible to me because, the divestment stuff is great. I also teach part-time at Columbia, and there, I can tell you, like Columbia made this big announcement about divesting their endowment, but there are research institutes on campus that take six-figure donations from fossil fuel companies, and Exxon gives grants for one-off research projects here and there. So the divestment announcement is great with the endowment, but there is still a long ways to go to like de-oilify the university. And so, yeah, the podcast gets into a lot of that stuff. And I don't know, maybe we'll make Amy and Darna, who is the person that's co-hosting it for us, come up with a new word to describe this insidious state that exists.
Yeah, that podcast, I'm just going to say, like, I think it's such a great topic, and I'm so glad someone's doing something on it. Yeah, and obviously both Darna and Amy are pretty amazing. So yeah, everyone, I think we're going to be able to put the link in to the chat shortly. We're looking for it right now, but that's a great one to follow. Someone from the Q&A asked about the term Anthropocene as a term that potentially has the same problem as
human behavior?
As human behavior. Yeah. How do we feel about Anthropocene? Because I feel like there was a while when it was a very trendy word and people felt like it was a way of like philosophically like conceptualizing what it meant like to have human impact on climate. But man, it also has that other side to it. Poll?
Yeah, I'm not a fan. I think that word never cracked out of the climate atmosphere, if you will.
Wow.
Thanks, Brian.
That's good. I like
it's too too long. Nobody really knows what it means. You gotta like, you know, have a minor in Latin or whatever the fuck to figure it out. I never really figured out how to pronounce it. It's just too clunky.
I mean, it's the same problem as human behavior, you know, just the same analysis you would make of human behavior, you can make of Anthropocene. And also, you know, there's like, it speaks to the sort of, I think it's like somewhere in the heart of a lot of like naturalists and nature writers and so on, is this sort of yearning for what the world was like before humans spoiled it all. And it struck me that Anthropocene kind of touches on that sort of impulse that I think is sort of a one to avoid.
It's funny, maybe this is my like hippie, like I used to hang out with elk self coming out, but I do have a slight soft spot for the Anthropocene, if only because I have like a running Twitter thread of postcards from the Anthropocene, which I think is like actually an interesting way to think about it for me personally. But in this thread, it is neither here nor what is in it, except to say that someone actually suggested some other ideas, one of which was the Petropocene, which I was like, that doesn't really roll off the tongue well, but is kind of an interesting thought as far as like, how could we reframe this around what is causing the changes to happen and with more specificity?
Yeah, it's an Petropocene, did you say?
Yeah, exactly. It's you guys say it a couple times before it actually flows. I was worried I was going to trip over it, so probably not the best choice for branding, but yeah.
Yeah, John, your point about the binary that implies is an interesting one I hadn't really thought about. But yeah, like this longing for a virgin forest kind of feel of Anthropocene, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I'll just say it has a bad mouthfeel, and I can't even get around to like what it means and all of those problems with it, because like just I see the word and I want to fight.
Yeah, people are talking about Capitalocene, which was the kind of alternative to Anthropocene by kind of Marxist ecologists, and also it rolls off the tongue worse, I would argue, than Petropocene. But I mean, you know, also it's a question of identifying the problem. They do that in different ways, and then, you know, what matters is the analysis and then what follows from the analysis that you do with it, rather than, like as Mary said, hitting on the magic word that will unlock the secret, you know, door to climate justice, if you like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, tough. Somewhat on that theme. How about existential threat? I'm also reading from the Q&As in terms of like a term that kind of lumps us all in together, but.
I mean, it is a threat to all of our existence. So I think in that sense, it works. I mean, I'm, you know, wrote an essay about, you know, how climate change is not the first existential threat. That does not mean I don't think climate change is an existential threat. It absolutely is. So I don't have a problem with it. I just have a problem with it being used. So this is the first time a group of people have ever had to fight for their lives. Like that erases a lot of people. But it's absolutely an existential threat. I don't see how we can argue that it's not.
Yeah, what's the problem with it? I mean, what's the?
I would hear it. Yeah. So my thinking was like, I would hear it all the time. Like, this is the first existential threat. This is the first time human existence has been threatened. Like, it's the first time all of humanity's existence has been threatened, as far as I know. I don't know what was going on in Pangea, to tell you the truth, but coming from, you know, Black folks in the South, like their existence has been threatened several times, thus the civil rights movement, thus the abolition movement. People have had to fight for their lives before. And it doesn't matter if like the whole world ends with you, you're just as dead. Like it's just as much a threat to your existence. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I had a problem with it being used as like, it's not the first existential threat. That first is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think the person also writing in was talking about existential threat in the same context as slogans like "we're all in this together," and the idea that it implies that we're all equally existentially threatened by climate change, which is a fair point. That's not necessarily the case. Not all equally threatened.
I kind of feel like during the pandemic, a whole bunch of rich folks like realized that their bunkers would not save them. because I swear, like when all that shareholder stuff was happening with Exxon and Shell and all of those companies, like all of a sudden their boards were demanding that they take more climate action. I think a lot of people realized they were closer to the boat everybody else was in than they thought they were. But everybody knows is not in the same boat. And it does do a disservice to pretend that everybody is going to suffer equally. It also does a disservice to go too far in the other direction and act like only some people are going to suffer and others will be perfectly fine. Because even if, you know, all the rich folks go to New Zealand is not big enough to hold all the rich people in the world. They might be a 1%, but that's still a lot of people. And it's not going to be cute in New Zealand. Eventually their resources will run out. Like there is no place that is going to be untouched if we don't get this under control. And they're not going to be able to go to Mars, because if you think it's hard to get climate action here, think how hard it's going to be to terraform Mars. We haven't even figured out how to get carbon out of this atmosphere. You realize what you'd have to do to make Mars livable? And these people are like, you know, they're weak. Who wouldn't make it? So yeah, we are all facing this threat. But we're not all facing it at the same degree. And there's a middle ground there that's difficult to capture with a slogan. And so maybe we should stop trying to capture so much. We shouldn't expect so much nuance from a slogan, and allow for there to be that sort of wiggle room.
Anyone else want to jump in on this one, or shall we move on?
I mean, my only sort of discomfort with the existential threat thing is, again, it's sort of like about, it's a way of addressing climate change as a serious problem, but again, as a sort of problem for the future, or as a problem for somewhere later. I mean, it doesn't sound particularly, to me, the ring of existential threat is something like my kids will think about, or my grand, you know, it seems like a way of deferring thinking about the problem to me. But you know, I don't have a big problem with it, I guess, like Mary.
Looking for questions people have asked. I'm seeing a lot of notes at 7:33 saying that methane is included in decarbonization, which the point was more about the fact that the term tends to signify in common parlance something else that people take as focusing on carbon, but I take that point. That is a decent note. Anyone else have any question that they want to answer, or shall we turn this back to something super broad and fun to end on?
I mean, I saw what I wanted to answer, but now I feel like I want the super broad, fun to end on question.
No. We can do both. We got some time. Like it's what, 7:53. We can do this in 7 minutes.
All right, I'm gonna raise one really quick, which I saw in there, which someone said, and it was on my list. It was actually second to stranded assets, which is new normal. Which is a term that, like, and I have to say, I really hate that term. So I just wanted to put a plug for hating that term in there, because
I agree.
Yeah, you look out the window like, this ain't normal, folks. Like, this is not normal. And not only that, normal implies a steady state, and we're not anywhere close to a steady state. I mean, things are going to keep moving no matter what. I mean, we could stop emitting carbon tomorrow, and their atmosphere, you know, is like, takes a very long time to adjust to what we've done to it, or I guess what oil companies in particular have done to it, to be a little more specific. And so I think that when we think about new normal, I mean, the reality is, like, we're not going to experience normal in our lifetimes. We need to be ready for big changes. And so that phrase to describe anything, it's just like fingernails on a chalkboard to me.
So you want to normalize not normal? Like the new denormalization?
Yes.
Yeah. Heather, please bring us to the broad fun thing.
I feel like I oversold it now. Definitely oversold it. I was going to go with either natural disasters or the term climate change itself, because a couple of people asked questions along those lines. And I don't know if the climate change itself one is fully fun. Yeah, I guess if people want to answer either of those questions, yeah, share your thoughts.
These ones bedevil me. I think climate change is here to stay. And like, I don't think we have time to normalize a whole new word to lean into the normal, for Brian's sake. But global warming never took off. Global heating is not going to take, like, there's no people understand what climate change is writ large. Like it's become part of the vernacular. So creating a whole new word, even if it was created by Frank Luntz, I think we don't have time to reinvent that wheel right now, and we don't need to, because people understand what it means now. And the other word, natural disasters, I don't know what else to call Hurricane Ida. I know that I can call her extreme weather, but that doesn't fully seem to grasp it either. Like I understand that natural disasters are not natural. However, if I just say disaster, that could be a stock market crash. That's not specific enough either. And also it makes it sound even more random, like it was just an anvil that fell out of the sky on Wile E. Coyote or something. So I think natural disaster has a usefulness in the sense that like people, and we're not talking about like people in the academy, right? Like I think that the climate space is really, really, really dominated by people who come from technical backgrounds, which means it's dominated by a lot of people who think real literal. And I think sometimes that does a disservice. And I wonder if these are two terms that we overthink to our detriment.
I mean, I'll say like, I think I'm also on board with climate change. I think it's now understood enough that like, it's fine. I mean, it's like people get it. And I think it's fine to use. I mean, we'll use climate crisis on Earth Hour. We'll use climate emergency occasionally as well. I think those are all fine. Honestly, at the end of the day, like those, like the lump of climate blank, as long as it's not some crappy term, you know, crisis, emergency, change, like these are things people understand. And so as long as, you know, using them, I see no problem in like, we're there for now and that's all right. I'm totally happy to have that as something that people understand and are riled up about. With natural disasters, though, I actually disagree. I think that it's a really bad term. It makes me like, so we actually have like a story category in Earth Hour that's like natural disasters. And for a while, our writers were filing things there that were like, you know, Hurricane Ida or whatever it was. And I was like, no, we can't really file them there. Like we have extreme weather, we have climate change, like those live there, like earthquake, natural disaster, okay. But the other things I don't think belong there because there's just, I mean, you guess you could argue an earthquake is also unnatural because if it affects someone, you know, it affects the built environment, it's unnatural. But I really think that like when it comes to climate disasters and extreme weather, I guess I could understand Mary's hesitance on those terms. Like extreme weather, maybe not the best thing either, but like I think that it's a lot more closer to the cause and what's going on than natural disasters. So that's one that when it comes to climate discussions, I try to use unnatural disaster, which I think I saw Susan Hassel in the chat drop that as one of her choices too. And that's one that I'll insert instead, if I have to.
John, feelings on climate change or natural disaster?
Yeah, I honestly, it hadn't occurred to me to think very much about climate change as a term, just because of how I think normalized it is and how intelligible it is. So I don't think there'd be any point in trying to come up with something else, even though, you know, it's not an ideal way of describing the thing, but and I think I share Brian's concern with natural disasters. I mean, in the sense that, you know, I think it's always kind of dangerous to describe anything happening in, you know, the ecology we inhabit as natural. I mean, it always involves some kind of heavily interested notion of what nature and natural is. I mean, I also, you know, I don't know what, I guess my question there would be like, I'm wondering how much it matters, you know. Extreme weather definitely seems like the more accurate way to put it. But in terms of like identifying the causes and identifying the, you know, again, identifying the guilty parties to whatever degree we can, the way we name the consequences doesn't seem as important to me. But, so I could take or leave natural disasters, but I'd be inclined to accept extreme weather as a fairer way of describing it.
All right, I will add that, yeah, I don't know what to do with natural disasters. That's one that I think about a lot, particularly in like decks, tweets, deck being sort of the thing for those of us who are not immersed in the media landscape, the thing below the headline that kind of is like a sentence or so. Hurricane Ida in particular was a really, really tough one, because how do you call it a natural disaster when there's this rapid intensification over like unnaturally warmed waters, and then it's hitting an area that is heavy with fossil fuel infrastructure and whose like electrical grid has been weakened by decades of lobbying to keep it from being a more resilient grid. And it's like, I don't know what to do with this. So
you can't just call it a disaster without an adjective.
I don't remember what we wound up settling on for either the piece or like the tweets, but I remember being a tough one. Brian, do you remember what you guys did for Ida?
I mean, I have a like blanket no natural disaster unless it's like an earthquake or a volcano thing. So there's definitely no natural well, I shouldn't say that. Someone's going back and Google now and be like, you used it once. But as far as I know, we did not have a natural disaster usage in our coverage of that. But I think we mostly went with extreme weather.
Cool. All right. Well, we are nearing, we're basically out of time. Is there anything that we did not get to that any of our panelists would like to jump in on, whether about language in general, language and power, the need to go beyond language in terms of climate, a rant that we missed?
Yeah. I mean, I think we both spend both too much and too little time talking about the language of climate change. It's a really interesting phenomenon. Maybe that has to do with the fact that we're all locked inside and we're spending more time on Twitter. And that means that like we are all expressing ourselves in 240 or so characters, and people can apply any sort of context to something that wasn't there before. So I think that probably what I would want to leave people with is that this language, the people we need to fight about it are not necessarily one another, at least not in bad faith. Like we can get better in how we talk about this without just making it our jobs to police everything that comes out of one another's mouths. And the people who deserve that type of energy have Twitter handles too.
You're talking about your, what we call it, hobby of fossil fuel?
A passion.
Okay.
Cyberbullying fossil fuel companies on the internet, which is something I called green trolling. I hate that word, but I couldn't think of a better one, so it stuck. You know, we're talking about words. There's one I don't like, and I created it. So.
I mean, I'd just add one thing too, which I think, you know, having this conversation is really wonderful, and hearing from everyone here who's like so smart and thoughtful is really amazing. But I think that this really does also get to something that's really important, which is that like everyone needs to be talking about this stuff much more than we do. There's an epidemic of climate silence in this country, and like big part of that is because, you know, people are afraid to say the wrong thing, or they're like, oh, what's the right word? I don't know. And I think that's great that we've had this conversation about like words that we do and don't like. And like, it's true that there are things like, there's certainly language things to be discussed, but at the end of the day, like having conversations front and center with your friends, family, whoever it is about climate is like step one. And like from there, you know, start a conversation. You never know, maybe you'll come up with the right term. Maybe we can find that Anthropocene replacement or a natural disaster replacement, as the case may be. But I think that this conversation is a great conversation starter to have more of these for everyone that's listening. My
only final thought is just a rant I forgot to go on earlier, which was about sustainability. Just was brought up, I was reminded by coming up in the Q&A. I mean, just as another term, sort of like stranded assets and human behavior, that is a kind of term that began as a sort of environmentalist term and became a marketing term and a kind of lifestyle term that promises you know, the ability to keep doing whatever it is one is doing. I mean, that's what it means to sustain doing something. And that's kind of the spirit in which it's become, I think, a big part of the vocabulary of every kind of fossil fuel, energy company, logging company, mining company. I mean, if you Google any kind of one of those things you can think of in the word sustainability, you'll see they have a very well phrased and elaborate sustainability commitment on their website. And so that's like just another kind of, I mean, that's a rant to end on for me anyway.
All right, well, start with a pet peeve, end with a pet peeve. Thank you so much to our panelists, all of whom made like tons of food for thought here, I think, both for people who are working in this space, as well as plenty of people at home who are not in this space. I think, you know, making the point about the need to talk about it more broadly and not get hamstrung over linguistic battles is also a very important one. Thank you all so much for joining. Have a fantastic evening.